Good afternoon and most welcome to 1140. Today we will take a chapter from the book Poetry and Language by Michael Ferber, The Linguistics of Verse. I have no idea what it is about, therefore the more interesting. Onomatopoeia and sound symbolism. Onomatopoeia is one of the technical terms we most easily remember, perhaps because it's such an odd word, oddly spelled, which could be trochaic trimeter line by itself, but more probably because its meaning as it is usually defined and illustrated is easy to grasp and fun to think about. Splash, squeak, chirp, buzz, boom, zap, crinkle, hiss, whisper, pop, hum, murmur. These words and many more, which imitate real sounds, are said to be onomatopoetic or onomatopoeic. The definitions found in handbooks starts with words like these as instances of onomatopoeia in the strict sense as, quote, a word or combination of words whose sound seems to resemble closely the sound it denotes, end of quote, and then usually go on to describe an extended or more subtle sense as the characteristics of words that suggest by their sound shape any feature of what they mean, not just sound. It could be size, form, speed, solidity, duration, or almost anything else. The broader sense overlaps with sound symbolism, the most general term for the natural or apparently natural connection between sounds and their meanings or reference. It is sometimes called sound iconicity. Onomatopoeia is indeed an odd word, for its original meaning in Greek does not imply anything about sound similarity or mimicry. Onoma means name, and that later widened to expression and narrowed to noun, while poia means making, from the same root that gives us poem and poet. The compound could be translated simply as word making, or when we make new words such as the word Google or nouns biffles and bling, we do not necessarily base them on any associated sound or any trait of the meaning. Aristotle used poiemenon, the neuter perfect participle of make, to refer to a new word, a made thing, or made up thing. Some translators render it coinage, but that is to introduce a distracting metaphor. The two examples he gives, ernogas for horns and artera for priest, are not onomatopoeic in the modern sense. They came about by metaphor or metonymy, without regard to their sounds. Aretera, for example, means one who prays, a prayer, hyphenated, from are, prayer. The first instance of the word onomatopoeia itself that has come down to us is found in Geographica of Strabo. While talking about barbarians, he pauses on the word barbaron. He thinks it was first sounded out those according to the onomatopoeia, because barbarians had trouble speaking Greek, implying that they sounded like ba, ba. They were babblers. He then names 3 Greek verbs for poor speaking and calls them onomatopoeic as well. Batarizein, traulizein, and psilizein. All troubles with speech. And then gives 5 more nouns for sounds, such as klange, clang. Strabo thus established the word onomatopoeia as about sound mimicry. The sense it has retained ever since. Quintilian introduced it into Latin, as far as we know, in his Institutus of Oratory, the most influential treatise on rhetoric that has survived from the ancient world. He defines it in broader terms than the imitation of sounds, but it still has to do with natural fitness of some sort between sound and meaning, and his examples are all imitations. 2 examples from Greek: linxibios, the bow twanged, and sis of ophalamus, the eye hissed. Both unique instances from Homer and free from Latin: mogitus, sibulus, murmur. Murmur is murmur. It was a virtue of the Greeks that they invented many such words, but Latin writers scarcely dare to try it, and rely only on onomatopoeic words already long established. Quintilian seems to think that onomatopoeia is appropriate only in the earliest phases of a language, when there aren't many words yet, and that the Greek language more or less began with Homer. So not only do we inherit the sense of onomatopoeia established by Strabo and Quintilian, but the word trails with it a notion about the origin of language itself. That the first speakers made up words that echo or imitate natural sounds, and then made up more words by expanding these words and or applying them metaphorically or metonymically, that is by analogy or extension. This is somewhat like the theory Socrates advocates in Plato's Cratylus. There he tells his friend Hermogenes that Cratylus is right in saying that things have names by nature, and that not every man is an artificer of names, but only he who looks to the names which each thing by nature has, and is able to express the true forms of things in letters and syllables. Socrates goes on at a tedious length to give one etymology after another, most of them absurd by modern standards. They are not onomatopoeic in the narrow sense, but rather expressive of something appropriate to their meaning. Toward the end, he enters the field of what he has since been called sound symbolism, where he says that the letter rho appears to me to be the general instrument expressing all motion. and the original namer of things noted that the tongue was the most agitated and least at rest in the pronunciation of this letter. By contrast, delta and tau expressed binding and staying in place, lambda expressed liquidness and smoothness, and nu expressed inwardness, and so on. These speculations ought to have given onomatopoeic and other naturalistic etymologies a bad name. But it is difficult to let go of the belief that the word you have used all your life for a thing is the most appropriate word for it, especially if you know only your native language. And in every language there is a set of words that are incontestably onomatopoeic. Throughout the Middle Ages and well into the Enlightenment era, most scholars argued for a naturalistic basic of vocabulary, or even a divine basis, since it was widely assumed that God had given language to Adam. It was also widely assumed that God taught Adam Hebrew, though the book of Genesis does not say so, and that Hebrew was the language everyone on earth spoke before they pridefully undertook to build the Tower of Babel. And God confounded their speech. In fact, Genesis implies that God did not teach Adam Hebrew or any other language, but simply endowed him with the capacity for it. For God brought all the beasts and birds to Adam to see what he would name them. God, no doubt, had his own names for all of them, but either he did not know Adam's language, though they somehow speak together later after the fall, or he did not know what Adam would come up with as he was shown beast after beast and bird after bird. Poor Adam. Did Adam contemplate the inner nature of each creature and somehow intuit its most fitting name? Or did he agree with modern linguistics that words have an arbitrary relation to their meanings? John Hollander's charming poem, Adam's Task, seemed to make Adam a member of the arbitrary school. As the creatures appeared before him, he came up with names like these: Thou, Wordle, thou, McFleary's Pomma, though, 3 types of growl, thou Flisket, thou Kabash, thou Comma Erd Mashak. It was a long day for Adam, with little time to contemplate anything, so he must have tossed off at random the first sound he came up to his tongue. In parenthesis, but who could McFleary have been? End of parenthesis. At any rate, some sort of naturalistic theory, usually about onomatopoeia, governed most theories of languages or origins until the early 20th century. Charles Darwin was repeating a commonplace when he wrote in The Descent of Man, 1871. I cannot doubt that language owes its origin to the imitation and modification of various natural sounds, the voices of other animals, and man's own instinctive cries aided by signs and gestures. End of quote. It is hard to credit any other theory, in my opinion, but if language is as old as some linguists now think, perhaps as old as our species, or even only as old as, say, a few thousand years before the exodus from Africa, it is hopeless to attempt to reconstruct its original form, though some linguists have tried to do so. So we can certainly track the continual infusion of imitative sounds into ancient and existing languages. But this is secondary to the mainly arbitrary or conventional vocabulary of all languages, which are products of tens of thousands of years of evolution, during which all traces of the original words, if there even were original words, have long since melted away. Just how much effect the continual influx of onomatopoeic words has, however, and how large that influx has been, is not easy to determine. I think both are greater than most linguists believe. The cornerstone of modern linguistics is what the Swiss linguist Ferdinand de Saussure called the arbitrary nature of the linguistic sign. The sign is composed of two parts: the signifier, the sound or image, and the signified, the concept. And with few exceptions, he says, there is no inner relationship between them. So the concept tree is called tree on one side of the canal, Arb on the other, and across another border, Baum. There is nothing in the shape or color or size or anything else in a tree to commend one of these sounds over another. They are equally good and equally arbitrary. It is important to note that the signified is not the referent, the tree itself in Saussure's view, but rather the concept of the tree. While the concept may owe its outline to the existence of real trees, its full semantic character also depends on other concepts such as bush, forest, all in the same domain. And the relationship may vary from language to language. The key word is system. Signifiers in a language are composed of phonemes, whose sole virtue is that they are distinguishable from the others. P and B are different in one feature, voice. And this is enough to make them distinguish various pairs of words from each other, such as pin and bin. And flip flap and flab. Signifiers also enter into a system less easily specifiable than the system of phonemes, but based like them on differences. Animate, inanimate, male, female, young, old, large, small, raw, cooked, and so on. As for phonemes, Saussure claims their actually sonic character is of no importance. What counts is how they assemble into an indefinitely large number of different signifiers. What about onomatopoeia? Saussure considers onomatopoeic words along with interjections such as ouch as the two kinds of expressions that might be held up as evidence against the rule of arbitrariness. But he says onomatopoeic formations are never organic elements of a linguistic system. Besides, the number is much smaller than is generally supposed. Many supposed formations are fanciful, or they are the result of evolution from earlier forms that don't seem onomatopoeic at all, while even the authentic examples, such as TikTok, are only approximate, based as they are on a limited number of phonemes. And they too evolve under the laws of sound change and morphological change that admit of no exceptions. He says much the same thing about interjections. Either they are not really part of the linguistic system, or the system soon digests them. Saussure had critics among distinguished linguists, but his assumptions have been taken as definitive among the great majority of phonologists and semanticists. One of his assumptions, widely repeated, is that there are only few onomatopoeic words in any language. Is that true? Even if we take the term in the narrow sense as imitation of sounds, there must be hundreds of them in English at least, and more of them are invented every year. Here is an example of 50 of them. Babble, bark, bleep, boom, burp. I won't mention all of them. They are 50, okay? All of these, I think, are used as both verbs and nouns, and many can readily generate adjectives and adverbs, so they are not quarantined from the syntactic system of English and can infect other words. Boom, for instance, now pairs with alliterative partner bust to describe stock market cycles. It has entered other languages, le boom, el boom, der boom. We also have boomlet. Using it as a verb or verbal adjective, we can say the founder boomed. And he spoke in a booming voice. Among metaphorical extensions, to be buzzed is to be high or stoned. To be pissed or smashed is to be drunk. And you can make quite a splash at a public event, very far from a swimming pool. Click as a noun or a verb may have first, in the 17th century, referred to the sound of a door, or a lock closing, or a gun cocking. Cocking is. Later, it was the sound of a camera shutter opening them. I surprised myself. Then, as a verb in the 20th century, it could mean to fail in with someone or agree completely. To fall in with someone or agree completely. As in, I clicked with her on our first date. Then in the 1980s, we learned to click on an icon on our computer with a mouse, and even to click through a series of icons or screens. To left click, to right click, or why not double click? And the word has also spread to other languages. French, cliquer, German, anklicken. Twitter now permeates cyberspace with its tweets, making it a Twittersphere, in which the president can unleash his Twitter storms. And so on. There must be hundreds more such words, including many with influences that work their way far into their home language and then into others. So the borders, just a parenthesis for me, seem to be not as solid as Saussure implemented. Similar lists could readily be drawn up by native speakers of any other language. In French, for instance, plouf, prou, chute, glou, and so on. I imagine prou was loaning to Swedish. This is my pretty sure. We might, or it's on a, oh yeah, never mind. We might add that a few words with nothing remotely onomatopoeic in their origin may have acquired onomatopoeia by association with certain sounds. J.D. Sadler has provided a delightful example. The German word Gesundheit means good health and is the equivalent of our God bless you. But one reason we use it so enthusiastically after a sneeze may be that it sounds so much like a sneeze. A narrow set would be quasi-words like bow wow, or moo, or cock-a-doodle-doo. And perhaps a few of the 50 just listed would fall into this category. But then this category is also leaky, as most, if not all of them, could readily be promoted to words. The cow mooed and the dog bow wowed. Ka-ching, the sound of a cash register, is now in wide use. It was the title of a popular song by Shania Twain in 2003. After such cash registers disappear, the word might still be current, leaving most people puzzled as to how they come about. Still, a further beneath normal word status would be expressive para-verbal interjections, some of which might be onomatopoeic to a degree. There are a surprising numbers of these. One is the conventionally spelled tsk, tsk, or tut tut, but it is really an alveolar click, a kind of sucked alveolar T, made fairly loud, and not an English phoneme. Used orally, it's not strictly a word, though it has a meaning, disapproval or regret. But spelled out, it can be promoted like bow wow. You could say, she tisk tisk her pupils. Yes, and no, differed by one phoneme. But the two parts of must be separated by a glottal stop, which is not an English phoneme. So must the two parts of or expressing alarm or worry. For musing or considering, seems not to have a vowel, though it has often been spelled hum. The same is true for humph or humph, indignation or disappointment, conventionally spelled humph. There are quite a few others, such as phew, view, ahem, shh, shush, psst, ow, yuck, 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 ick, haha, brrr, ouch, ow, wow, oops, whoops, phooey, hooray, yay, yay, boo, yipes, yum, which is often now joined with yuck as a seemingly natural pair of opposites, yum and yuck. Our spelling system does not do justice to some of these sounds. And when they are spelled out, they sometimes engender new words, such as tisk, via readers who don't know what sounds they awkwardly represent. A friend of mine once joked that he was taken to tisk by his girlfriend. The most amusing of these sounds is the raspberry, or in America, the Bronx chair, used for derision or jeering. It has been described as an unvoiced linguolabial trill, and the IPA symbol has been found for it. No, I won't write it. Though it seems not to be a phoneme in any language. Why bother? There is no good way to spell it in the Roman alphabet. It is called a raspberry because of British rhyming slang, whereby the term is a modifier of an unspoken word, here, tart, that rhymes with another, fart, which is what it means, though in this case it seemed likely that raspberry also suggests rasp, a good enough description of the sound. From raspberry we get the noun and the verb ras for jeer or jeer. Saussure would reply that all of these words, insofar as they are words at all, are not just paraverbal sounds. They are only approximate. Even an imitation of a natural sound, such as a cock-a-doodle-doo, he would say, is conventionalized, as we can prove by listening to what French and German roosters say, cocorico, kikiriki. To Saussure, we could reply that, of course, these imitations are only approximate. What else could they be if they must be concocted out of a limited number of phonemes and produced out of the human mouth? All onomatopoeia is partial, ranging from fairly exact to subtle and dubious. And the evidence of varying roosters' cries cuts both ways. They vary indeed from language to language. But they do not vary by all that much. For example, in Hungarian it is kukuriku. In Japanese is kokke kokke ko. In Persian, guli guli gugu. In Hindi, kukruku. In Sudanese, kongorokok. In Thai, aki aki. And in Tagalog, kukwak. Tiktok lak. Or tala tala okokoko rokokok. These may sound quite different to some ears, but to mine they sound much alike. At any rate, no language, I believe, represents roosters with cries as moo, or bow wow, or peep, or neigh. It is partly a matter of taste or intuition whether and to what degree to call a word onomatopoeic or natural versus arbitrary or conventional. Linguistics in the dominant Saussurean tradition often rightly accuses naturalists of imaginary claims. But if these naturalists are often guilty of hearing things, their Saussurean opponents often seem deaf. In his otherwise excellent Linguistic Guide to English Poetry, for example, Geoffrey Leach writes, although English whisper and French chuchoter are both felt to be onomatopoeic, there is scarcely any phonetic likeness between them. Partly in response to Saussure and the arbitrarians, and partly to rethink the sometimes questionable researches of 19th century Cartelians, several distinguished linguists such as Otto Jespersen and Roman Jakobsen have made a case for the phenomenon of sound symbolism beyond the narrow domain of onomatopoeia. Among many examples they and others have canvassed, we can discuss only 2 or 3 here. One is the widespread use of a high front vowel, E, or other vowels close to it to indicate smallness, affection, or intimacy. The Romans language attach endings such as ino, ito, illo, or ina, ita, illa to nouns to make diminutives, or ina, ita, illa to nouns to make diminutives like a señorita is a young or maiden, señora. Zucchini is the plural diminutive of zucca. A guerrilla is a little guerra. In English, we use words like teensy weensy or itty bitty to mean something very small. The Scots use wee. A wee dram means a small Scotch. There is also pattern in the ictic words, that is, words that point to various positions with respect to the speaker, whereby the terms for nearer things tend to have a higher and more frontal vowel than those for things farther away. This and that, these and those, here and there, French, ceci, cela, and so on. There are some counterexamples, of course, one of which is striking: big versus tiny. Tiny has a diphthong I that begins with a low open vowel made farther back, so it ought to mean big, whereas big ought to mean small. And small itself ought to mean big. Well, in fact, however, when tiny and variant tine entered English, it was pronounced with a high front vowel, but the great vowel shift changed long E sounds to I sounds in most dialects, and since about 1800s, teeny has been in circulation to mean smaller than tiny. Big is an exception among words in its semantic field, such as great, vast, grand, huge, enormous, giant, gigantic, humongous. But there it is a big exception. A big exception may embarrass the sound symbolism school, but it need not to refute it. It is a question of statistics. We could need to know how many words in common use fall or do not fall under plausible symbolic categories in order to see whether there is a salient trend or not. It will be a long and tedious research project. A possible phenomenon that belongs somewhere in the realm of sound symbolism is what we might call rhyme attraction. The older forms of breath and death did not rhyme, but they do now. They are each, in fact, others only good rhyme. Did they fall into sonic orbit around each other? This is a good question. Womb is Germanic in origin and did not first rhyme with tomb, which comes to English from Greek via Latin and French. Did their natural pairing of meanings help bring about pairings of sound? And was doom a factor in the pronunciation of tomb? Doom seems the perfect sound for its meaning, and if it did not affect tomb, it might have well attracted gloom, which did not at first rhyme with it. A rhyming phrase like ill will might have kept ill in the sense of bad, circulating longer than it otherwise might have. A rhyming phrase like ill will might have kept ill in the sense of bad circulating longer than it otherwise might have. Think of that as a planet circling a star or similar. The mutual attraction keeps the other one alive or floating or circulating. And there are quite a few alliterative pairs such as kith and kin, rack and ruin, odds and ends, from pillar to post, and head over heels, where the two partners may subtly affect each other's sense. Such semantic effects of sound shape causes might seem arbitrary, but if so, they are arbitrary in a different sense from Saussure's usage. Poor Saussure. Those who advocate the importance of sound symbolism often cite certain patterns, such as the ST cluster at the beginning of words, having to do with stiffness, staunchness, steadiness, stamina, stand, stout, sturdy, staff, stick, stock, German stehen, Stamm. Though some of these words go back to the same Proto-Indo-European root, others seem drawn into this semantic field out of a sense that the initial sound is appropriate to the meaning. 4 other such sets in English at least are: 1. DR words having to do with water and the conspicuous absence of it: drip, drop, drizzle, dribble, drink, drench, dregs, drool, drawn, drain, dry, draught. 2. GL words referring to light: glare, glitter, glisten, gleam, glimmer, glance, glimpse, glass, glacier, glaze, glow, glossy, glad. Glad actually means to use. Used to means shining. Glade as an open sunny space. That's actually glänta in Swedish. 3. SL words about slippery or slimy things: sled, sleek, slick, slide, slime, slough, sludge, slug, slink, slope, slip. 4. SN words concerning the nose and the expressions it makes: snout, snort, snore, snooze, snarl, sneer, snoop, sneeze, sniff, sniffle, snuff, snot, snivel, snottle, snub. Snub. Again, many of these words are not related to one another etymologically, but seem to belong together anyway, drawn by what Anderson calls conspiracy rules. Skeptics point out that these patterns are confined to a single language or family of languages, though again, I don't know whether anyone has had the patience to trawl through, say, 100 languages to see if there are any translinguistic tendencies towards such patterns. And what about certain humorous coinages such as ramshackle from 17th century British English, bamboozle, flabbergast, or hullabaloo from 18th century British English, and a large set of 19th century American inventions: bloviate, absquatulate, descombulate, rambunctious, hornswoggle, skedaddle, shenanigan. These should hardly be called onomatopoetic, but they seem highly expressive of their meaning, and not entirely arbitrary. Discombulate we might call an autonym, as itself is a discombulated word. A more recent Americanism, gobbledygook, also sounds like what it means, in a way, because what it means is incomprehensible jargon. For a last example, take the set of doublets of the zigzag type. Unless the two parts rhyme as they do in Helter Skelter and Razzle Dazzle, the first invariably is a high front vowel and the second a low back vowel. Chit-chat, clip-clop, dilly-dally, ding-dong, fiddle-faddle, flim-flam, flip-flop, hip-hop, kitty-cat, knick-knack, mish-mash, ping-pong, it's not pong-ping, it's ping-pong, pitter-patter, rick-rack, seesaw, shilly-shally, sing-song, splish-splash, teeter-totter, tick-tock, ticky-tacky, tittle-tattle, wig-wag, wishy-washy. If there are 3 or more parts, the final vowel is even further back, tic-tac-toe, or eeny, meeny, meeny, mo. We could add bric-a-brac, which we took from French, and such nursery rhymes bits as a tisket, a tasket. I don't know why we feel this is the right order of sounds, but we do. They are so well ingrained in our habits that reversing them sounds weird. We may reverse them, of course, to make a humorous point, such as, he is so reactionary that his watch goes tock-tick. The debate of natural or symbolic sources of sounds continue. My own view is that the Saussurean or arbitrary school has the better of the argument, but not much, for it is too quick to fence off onomatopoeia and sound symbolism as anomalous and unimportant, underestimating as it does both the number of words that are not arbitrary or random and the way they have of proliferating and attracting other words. No doubt all words, however they come about, get absorbed into phonological system and then undergo sound changes over the centuries according to general laws, attenuating whatever natural basis they may have had. Yet even as this system digests and transforms its onomatopoeic nutrients, they in turn continuously modify the system they enter. To what extent they do so, even after centuries of discussion, still seems unsettled. Perhaps we could say that the same signifier can be both arbitrary and natural. Noam Chomsky has famously argued that all humans have an innate syntactic machine in their brains, a universal grammar that underlies the syntactic structures of all possible natural languages. More recently, he and Jerry Fodor and others have argued that we are also endowed with a universal semantic categories of concepts, perhaps quite a few of them, since the human mouth, tongue, throat, nose, and diaphragm are also innate and universal. Isn't it possible that there are universal phonological categories tied to meanings? It may be questionable, and Chomsky does not make this claim, but I believe that not all the returns are in yet on this question. Onomatopoeia and poetry. It may be, too, that the arbitrariness and systematicity of a language sounds, where any signifier might mean any signified, and all that matters is that the sounds contrast clearly with one another, so a sufficient set of phonemes is available to make words out of them, are pretty much all that is needed for the normal or more practical uses of languages, such as communicating information, giving orders, asking questions, and the like. So when we think on those uses, we hardly even think of onomatopoeia or sound symbolism. But in more playful, artistic, ritualistic, and self-conscious uses, on the other hand, this other dimension looms larger. When we give directions or gossip with our friends, we seldom pun or rhyme or imitate bird calls. But when we pass into the other mode, where the language itself becomes a focus of attention, it is no longer a transparent line of transmission, but an interesting thing in its own right, with various links to the real world. However this may be, poets seem to belong to the naturalistic school, or at least they try to make their own poetic language express the true nature of things. Nearly all discussions on onomatopoeia quotes these famous lines from Pope's essays on criticism. "'Tis not enough, no harshness gives offence. The sounds must seem an echo to the sense. Soft is the strain when the zephyr gently blows, and the smooth stream in smoother numbers flows. But when loud surges lash the sounding shore, the hoarse rough verse should like the torrent's roar. When Ajax strives some rock's vast weight to throw, the line too labors and the words move slow. Not so when swift Camilla scores the plain, flies o'er the unbending corn, and skims along the main. Generations of readers have found these lines brilliant instances or enactments of what they describe, but we should examine ourselves as we examine the lines. The sound must seem an echo to the sense. Pope says, the poet make the reader or listener feel. He or she hears the stream or the surge of the laboring of Ajax. Where the Pope has really imitated the sounds or speed of his subject, or only tricked us into thinking so, is not obvious. The sibilants in the couplet about Zephyr and the stream are meant to evoke the rustling of a breeze or quiet flowing of a brook, but sibilants dominate the next couplet as well, and the alliterating L sounds and R sounds in that couplet are usually thought to be soft and well liquid. Surely we are invited to whisper softly the first set of sibilants and to hiss or spit out the second set. And it is the sense of the words that invite us to do so, not the sound alone. More objective is the second couplet's metrical pattern, which makes us read more slowly. The three neighboring stresses in, loud surges lash, and hoarse rough verse, do delay us a little. As for Ajax, the same trick of successive stresses deployed 3 times, rocks vast weight, line to labors, and words move slow, slows down his couplet and conveys the sense of striving, even though strives itself is no more laborious a sound than strain and stream in the Zephyr couplet. Is the line about Camilla really swift? Swift Camilla goes nicely with skims in the next line, but swift Camilla's course is something of a mouthful and a speed bump. The next line, which is metrically longer and Alexandrine, seemed to go just as fast or faster. Pope is a wizard, no question, but his effects, insofar as they are separable from the suggestions implanted by the sense, have more to do with alterations of meter than words' sonic expression of a thing's nature. In the 19th century, it was still a widely held view that languages begin in onomatopoeia, and that ancient languages, and especially the supposed proto-languages of each family, such as Aryan, then used for Proto-Indo-European, show a closer connection to their natural sources. The German philologist Max Müller believed that there is a law which runs through nearly the whole of nature, that everything which is struck rings. Each substance has its peculiar ring. End of quote. To the extent that this mysterious ring is auditory and the speakers of primordial languages were attuned to it, these languages would be onomatopoeic. The poet Gerard Manley Hopkins, whose idiosyncratic poems are brilliant touchstones of sheer sound effects, was interested in this theory and made up a verb, to salve, for Müller's ring. In his great sonnet, As Kingfishers Catch Fire, he has these lines: each mortal thing does one thing and the same, deals out that being indoors each one dwells, selves, goes itself, myself it speaks and spells, crying, what I do is me, for that I came. With his alliteration on D in line 6 and on S and SP in line 7, and especially in the way he places the rhyme words dwells and spells around the strange but central word sells, Hopkins enacts what he is talking about. He makes the whole idea of selving of the thing seem natural or ring true. It is not exactly evidence of the truth of the idea, but it conveys something of what it must feel like to believe it. A more extreme but not unique claim about sound symbolism is found in Rimbaud's sonnet Voyelles, vowels, which opens with a list of equations between vowels and colors. A noir, E blanc, I rouge, U vert, O bleu, voyelle. Je dirais quelques jours, vous naissance l'attend. A black, E white, I red, I green, O blue, vowels. I shall tell one day of your hidden origins. He goes on to give examples of each color, ending with O the omega, violet ray of her eyes. Rimbaud never did tell of their hidden origins, and no scholar has come up with a convincing theory, but the poem has haunted poetry readers since it first appeared in the 1870s by raising the possibility of a mysterious connection between sights and sounds. Another French poet, Mallarmé, found the French language perverse in making jour sound dark and nuit sound light, in contrast to Latin dies and nox, presumably, but is no more perverse than, say, German Tag and Nacht, with identical dark vowels. If Mallarmé thought vowels have inherent meanings, Galway Kinnell, among others, seems to relish words for their consonant clusters. In his sonnet Blackberry Eating, he celebrates certain peculiar words like strengths or squinched, many-lettered or one-syllable lumps, which belong to the black language of the berries. If berries could speak, they might speak in such lumps. In any case, they taste and feel like these words in our mouths. Something of the power of poetry to capture the truth of things through sounds occupies the thoughts of Stephen Dedalus in Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. A phrase from a poem has entered his mind. A day of dappled seaborne clouds. The phrase and the day and the scene harmonized in a chord. Was it their colors? He allowed them to glow and fade, hue after hue, sunrise gold, the russet and green of apple orchards, azure of waves, the grey fringe fleece of clouds. No, it was not their colors, it was the poise and balance of the period itself. Stephen uses period in its metrical sense as line of a verse, not in its grammatical sense as a complete clause. Later, thinking of another line, darkness falls from the air, he will note, its black vowels. But in this earlier moment, a little more reflection, Stephen seems to reject the usual naturalistic thesis that a language or a poem reflects the glowing sensible world in favor of an interiorized version where an inner world of individualized emotions is mirrored perfectly in a lucid, supple, periodic prose. With this idea, we have abandoned the usual concept of sound symbolism for a more subtle relationship between emotions and what we normally call style. It is needless to repeat that Joyce was the greatest master of English style, and every English style in the 20th century, and that his novels are a masterclass in what a sentence can do. But they are novels in periodic prose, not verse periods. And this book is about verse. When we turn to style later in this book, we will consider to what extent it has an iconic or imitative character, a kind of onomatopoeia of order and pace of events. Is there visual onomatopoeia? By this phrase, I'm not referring to sign languages used by the deaf, which linguists have shown to be no less complete languages than any spoken one. A great many of their signs are obviously iconic. For hands can shape themselves and move about in ways that imitate objects and actions to a far greater extent than the mouth can make iconic sounds. I'm referring to writing systems of spoken languages. Is there something in the shape of the characters of a writing system that reflects the meanings they represent? Some scholars think that Rimbaud was referring not to the sounds of the vowels, but to the shapes of the letters. An idea no less obscure than sound colors, and actually rather less interesting. Though it's true that the original Phoenician alphabet was derived from pictograms, even in Phoenician writing, the signs must have largely lost whatever pictorial character they had and become conventional. And by the time they were recycled and tinkered with in the Greek and Etruscan alphabets, and then reprocessed again in Roman system, they had become simply a set of random symbols. There are graphic links between some pairs with some similar sounds, like C and G, P and B, and M and N, maybe S and Z, but they do not amount to links to meaning or reference. The Chinese written characters are a more interesting case. When Western scholars first learn about them, they seem to be an ideal writing system where each of its thousands of characters stood for one thing or idea. They were originally pictures of the things or ideas and later squared off and stylized when brushes replace pointed tools. The simpler ones combine to make more complicated ones. Sun behind tree denotes east. How well? Rice paddy combines with power to make man. Presently, man as counted by a lord who had quite a few of them working in his rice fields. The earlier speculations in the West about these characters, and indeed about the origin of language itself, dwelled on nouns, as if there could be a language entirely of nouns. In the late 19th century, the American scholar Ernest Fenollosa took the view that Chinese characters were mainly verbs and expressed actions. Chinese notation, he wrote, is based upon a vivid shorthand picture of the operations of nature. Both theories assume that a pictographic or ideographic principle underlay the characters, but that turns out to be true only a few hundred, if even that many, of the thousands of characters in common use. In fact, each character represents not a thing, but a sound, a single syllable. And since virtually all Chinese words have one syllable, each character corresponds to one spoken word. Even though Standard Mandarin has 19 consonant phonemes and 5 or perhaps 6 vowels, as well as 4 tones, that multiply the number of distinguishable vowel sounds, there are still inevitably a lot of homophones in this monosyllabic language. No two homophones, that is, no two words that sound alike but have different meanings, are represented by the same character. There are no Chinese homonyms like English grave or lie, for instance, each representing 2 unrelated words. To distinguish among several homophones, characters may combine 2 radicals derived from other characters, one to indicate the general semantic domain and the other to indicate the sound. Geoffrey Sampson gives an interesting example. The character for foundation includes a root for earth, which points to the semantic domain, and a root for winnowing basket, which has nothing to do with the meaning, but once had a sound identical to the word for foundation. To assume that pictures underlies the characters will breed absurd etymologies, such as the winnowing is the foundation of life, or that the earth is some sort of basket. Moreover, the sound similarities have been lost. Foundation and winnowing baskets were homophones around 1000 BCE, but the words for them today sound very different. A careful look at the whole range of characters then shows a development not unlike the path of onomatopoeia. It seems that a couple of hundred pictures served as original basis of the system, which then got stylized and somewhat abstracted, rather like the phonemization of imitative sounds, and then expanded vastly by means of character radicals that refer to homophones with unrelated meanings, with the result that Though this secondary expansion was not entirely arbitrary, the result, even 2000 years ago, was a system predominantly conventional and unnatural, its pictorial connection to the real world largely broken. Though Chinese poetry has a deep connection to music, and the phonemic tones were sometimes made the basis of meter, it would be surprising if Chinese poets, when they planned to write down their poems, did not sometimes exploit the pictorial dimension still traceable in some of the characters, perhaps in the way Western poets might bring out the normally neglected etymology of words. The long and refined tradition of calligraphy might enhance this effect. Whatever the case in Chinese poetry itself, the pictorial aspect of the Chinese characters, however misinterpreted, reinforced the Imagist movement and its sequels in English poetry. Ezra Pound, who gathered Fenollosa's notes and published them as the Chinese written characters medium for poetry, tried to establish a norm of poetry in which several images combine to make an implicit, emergent, or composite meaning. Many of his cantos consist of quotations from disparate works from disparate times, along with words in Greek, French, or even Chinese, both in characters and in phonetic transcriptions, with little, if any, connecting commentary in his own voice. In the space of dozens lines, we might find a reference to the hanging of Benito Mussolini, the death of the founder of Manichaeism, the god Dionysus, T.S. Eliot's The Hollow Men, the ancient city of Diocese, 2 rivers in China, and a few words in Greek from Homer. Eliot's own The Wasteland, 1922, sets a contemporary conversation in a pub among allusions to Wagner, St. Augustine, the Aeneid, the Metamorphoses, the Tempest, Sanskrit literature, and many other sources. Somehow, we are expected to intuit the commonalities among these segments and grasp the whole as a kind of giant ideal character, a character as imagined by Pound or Fenollosa as a complex visible onomatopoeia. Most interesting, fantastic. That was a speck of fresh air without a doubt. Many thanks for the tip, Kalle. Incredibly interesting. I already had ideas beforehand, and I was thinking of fractals and fractals as conveyors of knowledge, memory. And I read this today, and I had in the previous lecture, fractals is memory. Memory cannot be anything other than fractals. It's the carrier of memory. Can be no other thing. The realization has come now to neurology as well, I would say, and it's having fantastic consequences all over, we say, knowledge as a whole. It's very interesting. And I was thinking womb and tomb, they attract each other. Yeah, I can use that. I'll bring it.
I can turn the microphone.
They attract each other, and they work that way as single attractors. And this I wrote before I read the book, the article, the chapter. And here you see the similarity. And we have more unpredictable and less unpredictable. So whereas you have an harmony and a fractal attractor, you will get less unpredictable, more of stability, as in the poems of Ezra Pound, and this is quite a different way of thinking of language. And I really like my own prejudice, what the chapter was supposed to be about. It was really interesting. Nothing of what I thought came to conclusion, which I'm really happy for. I was thinking in terms of Japanese onomatopoeia, and now I realize I might have exaggerated how it works. It must be working more on the style, the more open style, as he describes it. Japanese is well renowned for having an enormous amount of words that are considered to be onomatopoeia. But maybe it has also connections to the writing signs, the kanji or the hanji, the Chinese signs also used in Japanese, and that they are, well, it's an incredibly much better explanation than I used to have. That was at my hand, because the life of me, I couldn't realize how so many onomatopoetic words in Japanese, there were no sound to imitate. Words like hard and tough, heavy, bright, jolly. It's very hard for me to find a sound to that. The explanation is so much better with poetry. It makes absolute sense. Once you establish some sort of single attractor, you can play on that. You can, as Pope did, you can put that rather nasty phrase in. I have to repeat it. It's rather nasty. I felt it when I read it as well. It is not nice at all. Not so when swift Camilla scorns the plain. But in the poem as a whole, this cut or attack on the poem works, because we have established stability, and therefore we can take in disturbances and still keeps the stability. And that makes the poem even better. And a normal poet would never have done that as Pope did. There's no chance of that. So what discovered is fractality, how something can become stable. And the pairs in language are not onomatopoetic as such, but they are something much more. Much, much more. And they participate in a way that is exhilarating, creative, but also incredibly clear. It's a little bit that the words speaks for themselves. We do not have to say that they represent something other. I would say that take on Saussure is a restriction, and it's not part of his philosophy. The restriction is in the mind of Saussure or in his writing, and we can open up Saussure because he's correct to a point, yes. But open it up, let other voices speak, and all of a sudden his angry voice will become more and more distant, and Saussure disappears somewhere in the horizon, and all of a sudden his theory can speak by itself. And with this additive or opening up of my mind, which it was actually, this is an eye-opener, it feels more relaxed to read something. And of course, this also greatly helps poetry. It shows the way in how to understand great poetry. Of course, it doesn't help you to become a poet, because that's another thing altogether. Then you need to be fractal in a specific way. It is not a system that is possible to imitate, but it can be explained and brought to other areas that might work in this more open way, spacious way. Compare it to space. This is the only thing I can really bring into the picture here. And that space, it felt like the poet spoke to me in a space. What he is creating is a space. My voice slowed down. And that is not a happenstance. That's not random. It is temporal and it's spatial. And space is also what we get from the poems. I feel more space around me when I read them. I feel I can bring in the horizon. It is broadening of the perspective. Because when you read like small prints, and I don't mean literal small prints, but small information bits, your whole gaze, your inner soul becomes narrowed. And this is actually when a system becomes predictable, when the fractality goes here and become this sinusoidal curve. This is something I mentioned in earlier lectures, is very typical for repetitive things that cannot be understood, and also people who cannot understand, because their gait, their movements are not fractal enough to have memory enough. It's a level. Memory is actually the great cause of retention, pretension, and understanding itself. It is just like in the robot of Pfeiffer, the Swiss engineer. It is in the movement we learn. Only fractality can carry. Nothing else can carry that much information. It is actually endless. And it can repeat itself in a way that is amazing and not repetitious, because it's iterations. Iterations that bring themselves. And I think language works more like iterations, making the whole language in the end a stable entity, a being, if you like, something that has its characteristics, something that is genuine, and that is not the same. All languages are not the same. They are living entities, so to speak. They have their fractality, and as he mentioned, has sign language, which is not so old, maybe 100, 200 years, I don't know, has now developed to become more stable, having dialects, having new expressions, having metonymy, metaphor, and also onomatopoeia, so to speak, with the hand. It is highly interesting, and in the end, the signs are going to play with each other, just like womb and tomb and doom and such. Sometimes the word can be out here, still have some attractor effect. Doesn't need to be mentioned. I also come to think of rhyming slang, like brown bread, or brown, as many people said. You try to avoid the word dead, and you say brown. And all of a sudden, brown is dependent on dead in a way that is reminiscent of this. You have bread, then you have dead. So you construct your own couple. And this is actually very productive. And in itself furthers language, make it more expressive. Then you just take bread and dead out and you just say brown. These are not heard. The only thing you hear here is brown. Another one is up the apples. Do you know what it means? Up the stairs. Up the apples is so common, it almost feels like a apple and pears disappeared, no, stairs and pears disappeared, and you just have apple in the end. And but they are still there. Without apples and stairs, without pears and stairs, apple would not work. But now you can, in all of London, you can ask for the apple. Where is the apple? And they will point to the stairs, no doubt. And that makes for language to become more intelligent and people to become more fractal and intelligent. It was the last journey I had with my company, English Matters. It was no problem, as the boss wanted to prove that every pub in London could serve you a pint of wife, or alternatively a pint of wife beater, which was a pint of Kronenberg, if I don't mismind myself. Why was it called wife beater? Well, you have this complex story here, and it involves reality, but reality and words, they can be interchangeable. When Kronenberg came to England, it was very unusual with strong beers. All the beers were 3.5. Kronenberg had a massive 5.5. And people still drinking the same amounts of pints, which I think is normal. If you're used to 7 pints a night, they would be twice as drunk. And therefore, they assume they would beat their wife. And therefore, in the same way, Kronenberg was 9 wife beater. And then you can say a pint of wife. Take away beater. In America, wife beater is something completely different. I think it's a t-shirt worn by men who presumably beat their wives. Sorry for laughing, but it's so comical. I mean, no harm here. But wife beater in America, I think it's that t-shirt, like net t-shirt, that men use, that hurt women. Of course, there is no pointer here. Language is not prejudice itself. It's I am that biased. I'm biased. Language itself is what it is. A wife beater, there was no offense to it, not at all. But I could be biased to it, which is a different thing. And I would say that the author of the book, he reveals some biases in Saussure himself. Some limitation, some lack of space, rather than his ideology needs to be changed. It is not, he's not saying, with these supplements we can fix the Saussurean theory. And neither is he saying, let's put an argument to put Saussure to death. No, he opens him up. It's a bit like Julian Barber. Excellent tip. I thank you very much. This was fantastic. Bye-bye for now.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.